Our final session focuses on privacy, which is another of the IIC's current core themes. It's my pleasure to hand over to Alan Friel, who is partner and co-chair Global Data Privacy, Cybersecurity and Digital Assets Practice at Squire Patton Boggs in the US. Alan will explain more about the format of the session and introduce our opening speakers. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I have two thought leaders in the data privacy space. First, Congresswoman Suzanne Delbene, who represents Washington's 1st congressional district, which spans from northeast King County, the Canadian border, and includes part of King, Samash, Sectig, and Whatcom counties. She currently serves as the chair of the Forward-Thinking New Democrat Coalition, the largest ideological caucus among House Democrats, vice chair of the powerful Ways and Means Committee, and co-chair of the Women's High Tech Coalition. The Congresswoman is the author of the Information Transparency and Personal Data Control Act that would set a uniform national standard for consumer data privacy in the United States. We also have with us today Alistair McTaggart. Alistair is a Bay Area real estate developer and investor, but he is also the board chair and co-founder of Californians for Consumer Privacy, the nation's leading consumer privacy advocate group. From 2016 to 2018, he created and led a ballot measure which resulted in the passage of the California Consumer Privacy Act, a legislative compromise which created a paradigm-shifting consumer privacy law. Then between 2019 and 2020, Alistair wrote and qualified another ballot measure, and in November 2020, almost 9.4 million Californians voted to pass the California Privacy Rights Act, which builds upon the CCPA to give Californians, in his words, the best privacy rights in the world. So I'm going to open it up by asking each of you to tell us how you've come to be involved in the consumer privacy public policy debate and what you think are the most things most in need of legislative attention and why. Congresswoman, welcome.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate the conversation, appreciate being here with Alistair, and want to thank the International Institute of Communications for this forum to discuss an issue that I'm very passionate about, which is consumer data privacy. I think that data privacy is a fundamental 21st century issue of civil rights, civil liberties, human rights, even constitutional rights. And unfortunately, the United States has no national standard to protect our personal information. In the vacuum that's been created at the federal level, states are stepping up and passing their own policies to protect constituents. We know that California, Virginia, and Colorado have all passed state privacy laws, and other states, like my home state of Washington, have made significant progress on their own legislation, and I would expect us to see more laws passed as we head into the new year. But this is quickly creating an untenable patchwork of state laws that is very confusing to consumers, very burdensome to small businesses, and leaves still millions across our country with no protections. So imagine you're driving across the country or you're flying, you go from one state, end up in a different state, a new dialog box pops up telling you that you have to agree to new provisions. You would be under a different set of rules. Your rights would change every time you're in that different state. And moreover, small businesses selling goods online would have to use considerable resources to comply with different policies in each state. And then we extend that to this not just being a domestic issue. If we don't have a domestic policy in the United States, we really don't have a seat at the international table. We know that EU has led the way globally with GDPR, and want to continue to have that become a global standard. We can't push back against China's new so-called privacy law without one of our own. So for all of these reasons, my background, both in running a small business and in startups, as well as in technology, I feel like we're behind on technology policy. And so I introduced the Information Transparency and Personal Data Control Act to create a national privacy standard in the United States. Some fundamentals of my legislation: it would require companies to provide their privacy policies in plain English and clear language, so people actually understand how their data be used and what they're agreeing to, making sure that consumers can opt in before companies can use their most sensitive private information in ways that they don't expect. The bill creates a unified national standard and avoids a patchwork of different privacy laws. It would preempt conflicting state laws. I think it's important that we have a federal privacy standard. And a policy is only good if we have strong enforcement behind it. My legislation would give the Federal Trade Commission strong rulemaking and enforcement authority to keep up with evolving digital trends and the ability to find bad actors on the first offense. I think there's also a role for states to play, which is why the bill also empowers state attorneys general to pursue violations if the FTC chooses not to. And finally, it would establish strong privacy hygiene, requiring companies to submit to privacy audits every 2 years, conducted by a neutral third party. We don't want to find out that folks aren't following the rules just because we see a violation. I think audit is an important role as part of this. And many of the ideas and part of this conversation have been through a lot of debates that have been had at the state level as folks have looked at privacy legislation. I know there have been a lot of other proposals, even in Congress, but I think there's things that are really important that I looked at as I was putting together a bill. First, I put together an actual bill. It's a real bill. It's a bill. It's been submitted as a bill. We have a lot of folks talking about messaging documents, frameworks, concepts. We're only going to move legislation if they actually start writing legislation, debating legislation. And I think that's important. That's why, to me, it's been very important to have actual legislation to address this issue, working with a variety of stakeholders, from civil rights groups to folks in the business community, both small businesses as well as folks in the technology sector, so that we're really thinking about not only what do we need now, but how are we being forward-looking in terms of where policy needs to be to support innovation and consumer rights in the future. And when we look at consumer protections, which is critically important, we also have to think about how this works and understanding the needs of small businesses, because this isn't just we're not just talking technology policy for a few technology companies. This is really foundational, impacts all sectors of our economy, and why it's so important that we think about how it can practically be used. And small business in particular, in terms of how they're able to make sure that they are able to keep up with policy. So we need, and then finally, we need that national US policy if we're gonna be talking at the international table about what global standards need to be. So critically important. We're behind. I think we need to get in. I think this is an urgent issue. So I'm excited for today's discussion, and let me turn it back to you, Alan.
Great. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm looking forward to getting into it. But I'm going to turn it over to Alistair to help us set the table.
Well, thank you, Alan, and Congresswoman. It's an honor to be on a panel with you. Thank you so much. Just of note, my friend and yours, Jim Himes, I'm an old friend of his, and I was texting with him yesterday, and I said I was on a panel with you, and he said to say hi. So, so a little bit about the current state of where the California law is. I guess maybe just some of the highlights of what we achieved last November that were not in the previous law. And essentially, one of kind of my goals was to get as good as or better than Europe. I agree with the Congresswoman that it's, we need to have a standard, a high national standard. I tried to at least set the state level there. So we have purpose limitation. You can only use information for what you say you're going to use it for. Storage limitation. Tell me how long you're going to keep it. Don't keep it longer. Data minimization. Don't keep Don't collect more information than you need to do the thing you're saying. Chain of custody, you can't just send it somewhere random. You got to make sure that wherever you're sending it has the same protections. A requirement for reasonable, appropriate security, a right of correction, a new concept of sensitive personal information that includes your precise geolocation. So I can say to a company, unless you actually need to deliver the package or the Uber to me, I get to blur my location within 250 acres. So you don't know if I'm at the mosque or the synagogue or the church or the gym. We obviously created this new data agency. We clarified that, when we say don't sell, it means also don't share my information for purposes of tracking me between site to site. And then again, many of the same things. This data protection audit agency will be the largest in the country dedicated to data protection. I'm sure everybody who's in the mix knows that the new head of that is the fellow who advised me for 2 years who's sort of my technical advisor. So I'm very excited about that, as he's a very deeply experienced privacy person, Ashkan Sultani. Then we have this new ratchet in California. The initiative process sort of trumps the legislative process. But again, the good and bad part of that one is you can't get weakened at the behest of sort of powerful forces if they wanted to do that. But at the same time, I'm a Democrat who believes in the democratic process. So the way this works for amendment in the future, because unless an initiative gives the legislature the right to amend, the legislature can amend, is it says, look, a simple majority can amend the law in any way, it just can't weaken consumer privacy. So I would like to address, this notion of a national standard. I think the risk of a national standard, first of all, I totally agree there should be a national standard because people around the country deserve protections. The risk of the preemption, however, is that you end up with this weaker standard and you don't let the states go further. And in the case of like health, HIPAA is a national standard that's a floor, not a ceiling. And that's a national precedent. In the case of finance, again, Sarbanes-Oxley, we have a national floor, not a ceiling, and so we can let the states go further. One of the issues with, say, for example, 1815. It's well-intentioned, and I say this with all respect, but if you look at the actual data, there is an exemption, the way it is read, there's an exemption for the bill, for the entire bill, for if the company wants to monitor agreements between a controller and an individual, including the terms of service. And the problem with that dynamic is then if you're a Google or a Facebook, you say, oh, we're just going to put this in our terms of service. And then the consumer has a choice, use it or don't use it. And then once they've used it, all their rights are gone, because as soon as they accept the terms of service, all they have to do is put it in, there's an exemption. So now I get to put in as many cookies and monitor you and do whatever. The same thing for the opt-in, there's an exemption for taking steps to continue or extend an existing business relationship. So all Google has to say is, oh, we have a consumer, they're using this. So again, those protections don't apply. This is what they're desperate for. These people want to have the dynamic where, because they know how powerful their product is, and their product is addictive in the sense that, I mean, I use it all the time, and I think they're a good company. I think they need some regulations, Google, but if the dynamic is I'm the consumer and I can either use or not use it, the consumer will end up using it. And if then the business gets to keep on doing business as usual, that's what's the difficult part. The knife edge you're trying to walk is, how do I have good regulations that allow business to flourish, that allows entrepreneurship to flourish, that allows this great, gem of our American economy, which is, information technology, to continue to flourish, but also gives consumers rights that are really important to protect their information. And I'll leave it with one statistic, which I'm sure everybody knows about. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 gives all law enforcement in this country the right to examine your stored electronic communications over 180 days old without a warrant. And people are like, really? But then you realize that is the law. Twice it's passed out of the House unanimously in an effort to change it, but it can't get through Congress because it's so difficult to get something through Congress. My concern is if you have a weak standard that is a national standard that preempts state legislation, you're going to be stuck for 30 years, and you're going to destroy consumer privacy in this country in a way that I don't think you need to, as long as you have a national standard that's a minimum standard, and like HIPAA, would allow states to go further. So that would be my 2 cents of this.
Thanks. So, Congressperson, your bill concentrates on transparency and enabling choice regarding use. Alistair had some issues with the scope and breadth of that choice, but notably, it does not include express rights of access other than with respect to sensitive personal information, transportable copies, deletion, or correction. What's the thinking there?
So first, let me start, and I want to address something Alistair brought up that I think is important for folks to remember, because I think it's a good point. The really last policy we had at the federal level, the Electronic Communications ECPA Privacy Act, was really Electronic Communications Protections were in 1986. A lot has changed since 1986. And the point that he made that anything that was left on a server, data that was left on a server, was considered abandoned. Now, I worked in the early days of email. It used to be that you had to download something from a server to get your email. And so it was abandoned if it was left on a server back in 1986 for a long period of time. I guarantee that everyone right now has emails over 180 days old sitting on a server somewhere right now. And those are not subject to a warrant standard, which everyone thinks they are, but they're not. And so when I talk about updating our laws and updating our laws to make sure that we protect our constitutional rights, in this case, in a digital world, that's a great example where we haven't updated it since 1986. And I've continued to work on legislation. It's simple legislation called the Email Privacy Act to make sure that information is subject to a warrant standard, but it still hasn't passed. And to Alistair's point, here we are, and we still haven't updated that piece. So it is critically important that Congress moves, and the reason states have moved, and I very much understand why states have moved forward, is because Congress has not acted, and that's why we're going to see states continue to move. But if we don't have consistent policy, we are going to have a patchwork, and that's going to confusion. And in particular, in my legislation, to answer some of the points you made, Alan, is we really focused on making sure we really had fundamental policy, because I think we need to have fundamental policy and build on that. There are issues with respect to facial recognition and artificial intelligence. If you look across the European Union, they've been working, kind of building on top and doing more. And Alistair also talked about areas that we need to build on. We need to start. And in order to make sure we really move forward, I want to make sure we focus on fundamental consumer rights and build on that, or we may never get started at all. So I think that's the focus that we've taken, is to make sure we have solid foundational policy, because that solid foundational policy is really what's going to start getting Congress moving here, because we're behind. And now I'm going to apologize because I'm probably missing some piece that you raised too, but I at least wanted to set the table in terms of kind of what the goal has been on our part. We're happy to engage with others and do more. We just want to make sure that we have real policy. We're not just talking about conceptual topics and frameworks, because we're past that point. We got to actually start moving forward and getting policy passed. So,
Alan, if I could just talk about that for 1 second. That again, and I'm sure that the Congressperson's intentions are to give more privacy rights to more Americans, but the effect of this law, if it passed, would be to deprive, almost 40 million Californians of the right to see their information, the right to delete their information, the right to correct their information, the requirement for these companies to have reasonable and appropriate security. The ability to say to a company, you may not use my sexual orientation, my race, my gender, unless you absolutely need to. The ability to hide within this sort of general location. All these would be removed from, 1 in 8 Americans. And we fought hard to get this. And so that's the part I guess I'm passionate about, is like, hey, I agree, let's have a national standard, but let's not remove protections that 1 in 8 Californians have fought for hard over the last 5 years. And I think, look, I think the notion of, oh, well, we can't have a patchwork of laws, that is something that the tech industry is desperate to propagate. But the reality is, if you think about sales tax, you're Amazon, you're selling in every county in the country. It's all different. Opening laws, your Walmart, you're operating in all these different jurisdictions. This is what big business does. And yes, it may be inconvenient to have 50 different laws. What you'll find out over time, look at the Colorado law. The Colorado law is very much modeled on the California law. So it's not like it really isn't the apples and oranges things. There's only so much thing you want if you are talking data privacy. You're talking about, I want to see my information. I want to be able to delete my information. I want to be able to correct my information. I want it kept safe. These are not very, I want my sensitive personal information. I want you to be able to say, don't sell it, don't share it, don't track me. There's like 10 concepts that are sort of around the world what people want with respect to their information. And so this is going to be different flavors of that, but I'm a big believer that if we let the states be laboratories of democracy, that'll be a better outcome for the country in this very complicated area.
Can I jump in just real quickly? Alan just said, one of the things that we do in legislation that I think is important is making sure that the FTC has rulemaking authority in this space. Part of that, and the reason that that would be so important is, take an issue, should I as a public official have a right to have something about me be deleted because I find it to be unflattering? Who is a public official? What kind of how do we make some of these decisions? If someone violates an app's terms and services and conditions and is removed from a platform, can the app ensure the user is blocked from rejoining the platform if that person requests their data to be deleted? There's a lot of things that are complex that don't necessarily have easy answers. I think it's going to be important that we have robust rulemaking on this and engage with others to do that. So anyway, just wanted to follow up because that's something I left out.
And just to jump in on that, one of the things we did is give the new agency rulemaking authority. And you raised an excellent point around deletion. So we don't say this is not a European style right to just kind of be forgotten. What the California law says is you can delete the stuff you've uploaded. So you have an account with Facebook, you put all that information on, because clearly I can't, if you and I have an email exchange, Congresswoman, I can't go and say, I want you to delete your emails. That would run afoul of fairness and sort of First Amendment stuff. So it's I think we have a thoughtful deletion, but still it's better than nothing, where you want to delete your information.
I'm glad we got to the issue of the scope of rulemaking and sort of the interplay between the legislative process and the regulatory rulemaking process. But let's turn now to enforcement. So CPRA creates the CCPA, that's the Data Protection Agency. HR 1816 treats violations as unfair and deceptive practices under Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, enforceable by the FTC and state AGs, but without creating civil penalty authority or otherwise expanding FTC enforcement authority, and limiting AGs to either injunctive relief or enforcement of their own state laws. Presumably they're UDAPs, since there's preemption on the privacy laws. Neither, however, have a private right of action for privacy noncompliance. Of course, CCPA has a very limited one for security incidents attributable to a failure to maintain adequate security. But I'd like to hear from each of you as what you see as the appropriate enforcement authority and appropriate penalties or repercussions for noncompliance.
Who would you like to have start? I can start, I guess.
That'd be great.
Okay. In my legislation, I gave the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, strong enforcement authority and a role for state AGs as well to protect consumers. We actually wanted to make sure we addressed both based on feedback that we had heard. The FTC has both the power and the experience to lead meaningful privacy enforcement. And we also would give them more resources to help them do that, because I don't think any legislation will work if we don't have strong enforcement authority. My bill does not include a private right of action. I think it's the challenge for small businesses in this case. The threat of litigation can be very costly for small businesses, and to be able to hire legal teams and engage in litigation, while small businesses, just a threat might cause them to go under, even though they might have a strong defense. We know California has a limited private right of action in its law. Virginia and Colorado have none. So when we look at various state laws and bills, I think a private right of action is not the standard. And so that's what the approach we took, is to try to make sure we address the needs of through the FTC enforcement, but also through state attorneys general to allow states to have a voice in enforcement as well.
And so, I think that probably at the federal level, the FTC is I'd support the Congresswoman. I think it is the right enforcer. I do think that it's really important to remove the sort of 2 strikes you're out mechanism, because right now having to have a consent decree and then only then be able to have enforcement. So I'm glad I heard you say that making the fines be payable the first time around is super important. That's what we do in California. With respect to the private right of action, I wanted to be very clear that it was it's very definitive in California. It's only with respect to a subset of very personal information, very sensitive information, and only with respect to whether or not essentially the company was negligent with respect to its security practices. And the analog would be, if you're having a bank and you don't lock the door and you don't set the alarm and my money is stolen, that feels different than if you had a bank robbery. If you have bank robbery, you can't do, you shouldn't be liable if the guy walks in with a gun, okay, fine. But if you were just negligent, that's where our private right of action is limited to that area. The rest of it, we have enforcement for the agency. And a lot of criticism we got because I got criticism from all sides, and from the more traditional advocates, we got a ton of criticism saying, look, if you don't have a private right of action, you got nothing. And my answer was, I've been a business person for close to 30 years. I've never been in any meeting where people said, oh, this is the law, let's just ignore it. So I think A, the law is a huge guide and sort of red line, and then B, the penalties are extraordinary, both reputational and more importantly, financial. So I think we have great enforcement, mechanism. And I just think whether it's the Attorney General, I think an agency makes a little bit more sense because I think Attorney Generals are elected, and there's always that issue of pressure from various forces. So I like having an independent agency where we have multiple appointments from the House, from the Assembly, from the Senate, and from the governor's office.
So let's stay with Alistair for a moment, although this is a question for both of you. Advertising funds the free and open internet. What is the right public policy balance between consumer transparency and choice and use of user data to make digital advertising more relevant and effective? Great.
So I think that there is, there's a difference in contextual advertising and behavioral advertising. Contextual, I'm reading the article about New Zealand, and I see the ad for Air New Zealand, or I see hotels pop up. That can be done in an extraordinarily privacy protective way. That is the technology that, frankly, that's the architecture that built Google and Facebook into the behemoths they are. And I'm older probably than you all, but the technology we grew up with, where you just stick an ad on a TV and hope someone sees it, this contextual advertising is light years better. Now you move to the behavioral one. Okay, I know you're a single mother. I know it's the end of the month. I see from your purchases that you're running out of funds. And now I'm going to show you the ad with the private island saying, if you sign up for this course in real estate, I'm going to make you $1 bazillion. I know that at 9 o'clock at night is when you typically have a drink. because I can see from your purchases that that's when you type out the impulse purchases, and that's when you order. I don't know if you're having a drink, but that's when you're most likely to buy. That's when I'm going to show it to you. That kind of invasiveness, I feel like you as a consumer should have the right to say, I don't want it. Now, if you want it, great. If you're one of those people who say, you know, my big problem in life is I don't see more relevant ads, which is what the tech industry would want you to believe is a huge problem for most Americans. They're like, we need to have more relevant ads. No one says that. Let's be honest. No one actually has ever said that. The reality is that that's a code for we want to track you more and be able to push you more in this direction. And I'm here to say that I think that there's a ton of money and a ton of prosperity around the contextual advertising, that the behavioral advertising should be allowed for people who actually want it, and that for people who don't want it, they should be able to use these services and not have to be subject to the tracking. That's the problem. The Faustian bargain right now is if you use these services, you are tracked and you are monetized, and there's no good way out. We in California are just giving you a good way out. Please, let's not go back to the world where the bargain is, the choice is either use my great service and we're going to track you and monetize you, or don't use it, because that is not a choice. That in this day and age, with these platforms that are essentially monopolies, you don't have a choice. You have to use Google, you have to use Amazon, or you end up having to. And so you don't really have a choice.
Let me add, I do think it's really critically important that consumers have the say. One, I do think, you know, when I talked earlier about kind of plain English on privacy policies, talking about what you're doing, it's so important that people actually understand what that is. And I think it's lost in complexity in legalese right now, you know, incredibly long documents. Most people say yes before they even, you know what they're being asked to do or what they're signing up for. So I think that's a key piece and why it's so important that that's a part of legislation. And people do need to know and need to be able to decide whether they want to participate in something or not. There's some services that might require information to be collected, or the service doesn't work. So we also have to think about what is the type of product or service that someone's looking at. If you want to find information about stuff that's near you, then maybe location would be critical to that. And so we've got to go through each of these scenarios and make sure that people understand whether or not they're going to be able to, you know, you can say that they should still have access to a service. Some things may not work without certain pieces of information, and people have to decide whether they want to provide those or not. So I do think kind of making sure that folks have the ability to opt in or opt out is important, and important part of that control. And but people need clear information to make smart decisions. They don't necessarily have that clear information today. And that's been a huge part of the problem with people having information being used in ways they don't expect, even if they technically agreed to an agreement when they signed up for a service, because it's so hard to understand.
And Congresswoman, your bill includes in its definition of sensitive personal information the consumer's online activities. So we've got this concept of sensitive personal information, and the definitions do differ significantly. CPRA taking an opt-out approach to uses not reasonably expected as necessary to provide the applicable services, and HR 1816 requiring affirmative consent for sharing, selling, or disclosure not consistent with notice at collection. Can each of you speak a little bit about what you think sensitive personal information is, how it should be treated, and just sort of purpose limitations more generally? Start with you, Congressperson.
Okay, happy to start. Sorry, I was just waiting to make sure I knew what order you wanted to go in. So I do think there's important, we look at personal information, there's very sensitive information that should have, where you should have to get affirmative express consent before companies can collect and share. For example, sensitive information can include financial account information, health, genetic, biometric information, information pertaining to children, social security numbers, usernames and passwords, sexual orientation, and gender identity, geolocation, citizenship or immigration status, religious beliefs. This is that's an example of very sensitive information. There's also information that you could call non-sensitive information, where consumers should have the right to opt out of companies collecting. So, for example, if someone's a member of a HIV positive support group on Facebook, there's nothing that prohibits Facebook from selling this information or providing that status. I think we would agree that this is sensitive information, and that's where for example, in our legislation, it would be designed to protect that information. And so that's, to answer your question, in terms of making sure we're being strong about protection. I think there are cases, and I tried to outline those, where you have to give consent before that information could ever be collected or shared.
And then with respect to non-sensitive personal information, your bill provides an opt-out of any collection, transmission, or selling, including with third parties. But there's a provision that would contemplate exceptions. Do you expect the FTC rulemaking process to define the scope of the opt-out and what the exceptions are, or is the statute a definitive list in your mind?
So first of all, I think consumers should have the right to opt out of any data being collected on them. As I said before, there's certain information that's necessary to use certain services. And so you could turn off location services for a ride sharing app, but they might need to know where you are to pick you up. So I think the FTC definitely can issue further guidance on where that line can be on specific scenarios, because I'm using a scenario that might have be very clear. There are others that may not be quite as clear. And so I agree that the FTC should play an important role of providing guidance.
And Alistair, the concept of sensitive personal information is new in CPRA, so that's going to amend the current bill. What was the thinking for the need of a different category and a different approach?
Well, quite frankly, it's drawn from GDPR and I think it's a good idea, so that's why we put it in. And again, on the notion that you're trying to get best in class. We have a list of things that most people would think of. Their sexual orientation, their gender, their race, their health information. We end up saying, look, and I think that the Congresswoman is bringing up a really important point. And this is why it took 5 years. You're trying to say, how do you not break the internet, but also have reasonable protection? So if it's necessary for a service to work, you don't want to say the service can't collect it or use it. But you also want to say, but by the way, that shouldn't be a backdoor for being able to then get around the law, right? And again, I kind of come back to some of these exemptions, which I think are well-meaning, but when you read through them, if I can get away from, in 1816, from the restriction, the opt-in restriction as a business, because I can argue, well, I'm just taking steps to continue an existing business relationship, and I have a user, then it's not worth anything. Or if I can say with the exemption from the entire bill for monitoring an agreement between a controller and an individual, including a term of service, all I have to do is monitor it, and then I'm good to go. There's no restriction on me. And so if one thing is, Congresswoman, I would welcome the opportunity to talk to any of your staff and just kind of, if it would be useful, you may not want to hear from me, but just to try to, highlight some of my concerns with this, because I am very concerned that this bill would achieve what you don't want it to achieve. This bill would, I think, really set privacy back dramatically. And I know that's not what your intention is here, but I've seen these companies, they'll argue, oh, we need a data for warranty on cars because it's a safety thing we need to get in track. But when you read through it, it's like, oh, but actually now you're going to get to monetize and every single place I am during every single drive I ever do. So it's a question of actually just kind of tweaking the wording there. And I think going back to the sensitive personal information, what we say precisely is that no, you can't argue that you can't use it if I'm on a ride shared service. If you need it to do the thing I'm asking, then you don't get to restrict it. But equally, you don't need to know my sexual orientation to sell me toilet paper. And so there's a it's a fine line, and you're trying to walk that line of practicality, allowing businesses to exist, but also giving consumers meaningful rights.
So we have a few minutes left. I want to turn to international as a lead into the next panel. The Europeans obviously have GDPR. Chinese now have their own privacy law. What are the consequences of not having a national privacy standard in the US and in the global context? And Congressperson, the Commerce Department continues to negotiate with the EU regarding a way forward with a potential replacement of Privacy Shield to facilitate transatlantic transfers. It appears to be hung up, and there's some real challenges there. How are you and your colleagues on the Hill seeking to address this?
Thanks. And just quickly to Alistair's point, we've been working with everybody. We're happy to have conversation on this too. It is critically important that we have federal data privacy legislation. And so we have and continue. That's why I put out a bill, because I want us to not just talk about concepts. I want us to talk about what a specific piece of legislation looks like so we can get this done. To the international point, Alan, that you bring up, we, in fact, someone from the EU said, we have a lot of different member countries who might disagree on things. We figured out a way to bring everybody to come together and come up with one consistent policy. And so I think that, their question was, why hasn't the US been able to do that yet? And I think that that's the important point that I bring up about a consistent federal standard and how important that is for us to also have a voice at the international table. The other reason what you brought up is the European Court of Justice struck down the Privacy Shield. And one of the reasons behind that was concerns that we don't have strong privacy protections in the United States, across the United States. And so it is, again, important that we have a consistent federal law, but one reason, for all the reasons we've talked about before, but another reason is because that helps us also make sure that we maintain the international agreement between the US and the EU, for example, with respect to the Privacy Shield. If we're really going to have international data flow agreements, which is so important for so many sectors of our economy, it's important that we also have strong legislation here. And we've seen both Republicans and Democrats on the relevant committees release discussion drafts of privacy legislation. But, and this should be something that is very bipartisan, I would argue. I actually think it's possible for it to be bipartisan. But we still haven't seen that bipartisan piece of legislation. And one of the big issues is that people just aren't willing and maybe have still confusion about what exactly they think a legislation should look like. And so one of the things that I've looked at too is what are the things that we can do to bring folks together, again, to help us move forward on getting privacy legislation across the finish line. But, and we pushed on that conversation and we'll continue to do that so we can actually get legislation in place that gives us a seat at the international table and again, addresses issues like the decision with respect to Privacy Shield.
Alistair?
And I'll just say, obviously the GDPR, one of the interesting parts of it is it allows for territories to get adequacy. I spent a lot of time with Europeans making sure, I know that adequacy depends also on national security issues, which obviously a state can't address, and is a political decision of the EU. But with respect to just the core principles of adequacy, the California law would be deemed adequate, I'm certain, because we have got all the core principles. And that's what would be sad to me about 1816 is it's a country mile away from being able to be adequate. It doesn't have purpose limitation, storage limitation, right of access, correction. You'd want at least the protections in national standards to be equal to be able to be deemed adequate and it's not that the Europeans are the greatest things since sliced bread, but it is a standard that is become globally recognized as sort of, this is a sort of minimum standards, fine, go further. You'd like to at least have that for our, 300 million people as well. And so at least now 1 in 8 have that. And I think that the new agency will actually seek adequacy from the Europeans. And I think if the administration can solve the national security issues that are affecting TREMS, I actually think then the second question is, okay, great. Now what's the standard? Oh, there isn't one, but actually California provides that standard. So I think that there's a path forward for the United States. And again, I'm not, as an American, I would much prefer a federal law that protected all Americans, but one that, as I say, that allows states to go further.
Congresswoman, Alistair, thank you both for your leadership. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. This has been fascinating for me. It was a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to both of you. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Lynn to introduce my partner, Anne LaFrance, and the next panel. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.